Hello, I'm Shannon Tiezi from the Diplomat, and I'm joining you here today from the Middle East Institute, where I'm happy to welcome Dr. John Calabrese. Dr. Calabrese is a professor of U.S. foreign policy at American University, and he is also the director of the Middle East Asia Project here at MEI. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Calabrese is going to be talking with us about China's role in the Middle East. Like so many countries, China has been following the situation in Iraq with a lot of concern and worry. Dr. Calabrese, what exactly is at stake for China here should the situation in Iraq continue to deteriorate?
The stakes for China are actually pretty significant and have been in fact growing in recent years. Number one is China's investment in upstream oil field development. In fact, Chinese oil companies, you could say, since the overthrow of the Saddam regime, have emerged as the dominant actors in the energy sector. So investments, and investments specifically in the energy sector, are important to China as a whole, but specifically to its major oil companies. The second interest, the second stake, also relates to energy. In recent years, China, like many other countries that are dependent or have grown increasingly dependent on oil imports, have sought to alter the composition or, in fact, diversify their sources of supply. And as China has grown more and more dependent on Saudi Arabia and has had some problems in trying to sort of balance its relations with Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's seen Iraq as being an important source both within the Gulf and more broadly in terms of its global sources of supply. So that's the second stake. And the third stake is a stake that, in fact, China has in common with the United States and with the United States as allies. And that is the threat not only of the destabilization of the region, but more particularly the rise of what you might call jihadism or extremist Islamism, and how that might impact China domestically.
So you mentioned that China is especially interested in energy concerns in the Middle East and diversifying its supplies. As China is interacting more and more with various governments in the Middle East to secure these oil supplies, do you think we're going to see a corresponding increase in China's political influence and political role that it wants to play in keeping this region stable?
Well, I think that there are several factors that you have to keep in mind, as well as defining what is meant by, a political role or a diplomatic role. I mean, it's clear to everyone, including China's partners, commercial and otherwise in the Gulf, that China today is not the China of 30 years ago. It is a global economic actor, unsurpassed except for possibly the United States. And so it seems to me that some role of some kind on the diplomatic stage in terms of sort of consultation on issues of common concern is almost inevitable. Whether that translates, though, into influence and the extent to which China's influence with respect to Gulf governments or Middle Eastern governments more broadly, how that intersects with United States positions and United States policies, looking at it from an American point of view, that's another question entirely. An additional thing I would mention here is, does China have the interest or the will, let's just say, to play a more creative, a more assertive, a more proactive role on the leading and most controversial issues of the day, whether it's nuclear non-proliferation or conflict resolution? That's another question entirely. And on that question, I'd be happy to discuss with you what I think the trajectory is, both in the short term and maybe in the longer term.
Let's have that discussion then.
Sure.
Do you think that China is angling to play a leadership role on these more sort of long-term issues? And if so, how is it going to use its influence?
I think in the shorter term, China is very reluctant to do it. And there are a couple of reasons why. Number one, Chinese commercial interests have been growing. And it has been a very lucrative relationship that the Chinese side has had with its Gulf partners. And, I don't, so basically, the kind of low-profile approach that China has, purposefully followed until now has appeared to pay off. So from that perspective, I don't see that there's any immediate urgency or necessity for China to alter its course. When and where it does alter its course, I think, seems to have depended and will probably depend in the short term on how much pressure is exerted both by its partners in the Gulf to take a more assertive position, or by the United States. When the U.S.-China the relationship with the United States means far more to the Chinese, certainly now, than the relationship between China and any one, not to mention all, of its Gulf partners. In the longer term, I think I will add one more thing, and that is that, at least for the foreseeable future, the high priority area, other than domestic concerns and a multitude of challenges that the current Chinese leadership faces, is the situation on its immediate periphery, in its own neighborhood. And its own neighborhood is East Asia. And therefore, the extent to which China is sort of concerned with deploying resources and energy and vision, that's closer to home. And sort of its more distant concern and a lower threshold priority for China to, in the short term, want to play a more assertive role, political and diplomatically, in the Gulf.
Mm-hmm. Now, currently, China has been able to maintain pretty close and stable relationships with a number of historic rivals in the region, with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, and with Israel. Is there any concern in China that becoming more involved in the region might lead to an imbalance, say, where maybe Iran is happy but Israel is upset, or Saudi Arabia is happy but Iran is upset?
I think one of the risks or potential costs of China's growing stakes, as you put it at the outset, particularly in the Gulf, is striking the right balance given all the fault lines and adversarial relationships that exist. But until now, I think that China has managed to navigate pretty effectively. Now, what does that reflect? It might reflect that China's partners individually need China as much, if not more, than China needs them. And therefore, China may be under pressure by individual countries to take sort of fundamentally different stands than they have in the past, but recognizes that that even if China, well, not if China were to do it, but recognizes that there are limits to what it can realistically expect from the Chinese side, and that rather than repeatedly issue démarches and demands and ultimata, and thereby strain a very profitable, mutually beneficial relationship that, it's going to continue to press and push, but not run any risks of their own.
Mm. So we've talked a little bit about what the U.S. might want from China and about what regional partners might want from China. What do you think China's goal is for its presence in the Middle East? Does China want to play a leadership role, or would it prefer to continue this low-key, hands-off approach over the longer term?
Over the longer term, I think the jury is out. Because, energy and access to energy is so important. It's inseparable from geopolitics. And so it's not just about prestige. It's about survival and prosperity and power. and therefore, when I look at the longer term from the Chinese perspective, it's hard to get out of my vision this looming figure called the United States. And so it's not exclusively dependent on U.S.-China relations and on the U.S.'s role and the power projection capability of the United States, but there is no question that all of those things figure very prominently on what China's strategic objectives are likely to be and how they will pursue them in the longer term. So here are a couple of examples. With the unconventional oil and shale gas, the golden age of gas, how will this affect the United States' dependence on the Gulf? This is a debate that's now been emerging in the United States. Will the United States, given its own fiscal constraints, given public attitudes, given the changes in its own sort of energy dependence or independence, be willing to play the role of security guarantor in military terms that it has traditionally played? If the answer to that is yes, then in some ways the Chinese are more confident and comfortable and would not have to pursue necessarily and bear the cost and bear the responsibility and stick their necks out and simply pursue the same policies that they have, which is to free ride on the United States' role. Now, that said, there is some, how would you say, secondary ill effects, suspicions, or worries that the Chinese have, even with the United States continue to play its role. Because what the Chinese have to be concerned about is if U.S.-Chinese relations were to deteriorate, if the bilateral relationship were to deteriorate, or if the maritime disputes in East Asia were to create a cascade of sort of negative side effects in U.S.-China relations, would the United States, using its military capabilities, seek to undermine China's access or disrupt China's access to Gulf oil? So it's a very complicated equation. I don't know that the Chinese side has a very clear, firm, sort of strategic approach to how it will deal with the Middle East and with its increasing dependence on oil and really its irresistible impulse to continue to buy from the Gulf. But I can say for sure that the role that the United States plays and will play, and whether the U.S.-China relationship can remain on an even keel and that these countries can find common ground rather than become sort of adversaries in a new Cold War, will play will be a major factor, if not the determining factor, in China's strategic calculations.
Well, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Once again, I'm Shannon Tiesi from The Diplomat.